Hey everybody. Thanks to everybody who joined. Let's get started. My name is David Fogel and I'm the Executive Director and General Counsel here at the NBA Coaches Association. We are the labor organization that represents all head and assistant coaches here in the NBA. We had over 100 NBA and college coaches register for this event, so we're extremely excited, and we are especially excited to collaborate with the Black Coaches Association to celebrate Black history and to host an impactful conversation on leading today's generation of players. With that, I'd like to pass it on to my good friend and the associate head coach of the Indiana Pacers, Coach Lloyd Pierce.
Good evening, everyone. Really excited about tonight's conversation. It's aimed at challenging our perspectives, being educated on pivotal moments throughout our rich Black American history, all in an effort to inspire and for us to become better mentors and leaders. Black History Month is a great reminder for us all to recognize the collective strength, resilience, brilliance, innovations, struggles, and courage of the many great Black leaders, including athletes and coaches throughout American history. By recognizing and deepening our understanding of the challenging journeys of our ancestors, we can honor their legacies and ignite our continued commitment to increased opportunity, diversity of thought, and overall Black excellence. We're excited about tonight's conversation and our featured speaker, Bakari Sellers, our moderator, Vince Goodwill of Yahoo Sports. But first, we want to honor a coach and a pioneer in women's basketball. And in doing so, we want to honor an individual who helped put this event together. Pooh Jeter of the Portland Trail Blazers came to me a few weeks ago and wanted to have this conversation with the NBA Coaches Association in addition to the Black Coaches Association. So right now, I'm going to pass it to Pooh Jeter as he speaks on a pioneer in our industry and in African and Black history in our country. Pooh, welcome.
Thank you so much, Coach. On behalf of the Black Coach Association, I want to thank NBCA for allowing us to have this amazing moment. Um, I don't know if Coach Washington is on, uh, but I most definitely will want to be able to honor Coach Marian E. Washington, who was named the Jackie Robinson of women's basketball coaching by the Washington Post in 2022. She broke the color barrier when she was hired as a coach in 1973. Then 1 year later, she became athletic director. Um, you know, her time at University of Kansas, she's won 560 victories in 31 seasons. And while she was there, she was coached as Kansas only 4 All-Americans, including Naismith Hall of Famer Lynette Woodard, who held the scoring record for the women's basketball for 40 years. Um, in 2004, Coach Washington was inducted into the Women's Basketball Hall of Fame. She was also two-time Naismith Hall of Fame finalist. Um, when Coach Washington stepped into Kansas Allen Fieldhouse for the first time in 1973, only one room in the arena was dedicated to women, and that was the public restroom. Today, the Marian E. Washington Women's Basketball Suite is among the finest facilities in the nation. Back in 1996, she became the first Black woman to coach on the U.S. Olympics women's basketball team, serving as assistant coach. And the reason why that was happened because she made that well known, for the world. And she made that change for coaches, when she was the president of the Black Coach Association. So, let's give Coach Marion E. Washington her flowers. I wish she was able to be on the call. I know she's having a little trouble getting on, but let's make sure we do our job as in honoring Coach Marion E. Washington. So salute.
Appreciate that, Pooh.
Perfect. Thanks, Pooh. And with that, if you want to throw my slide up one more time, if at any point during the conversation. If anybody wants to ask any questions, feel free. My cell phone is right there, so feel free to send me a text, and I'll make sure we can get it to the panel and our esteemed moderator. And with that, I would love to introduce Vince Goodwill. Vince is a senior basketball reporter for Yahoo Sports. Vince also covered the Chicago Bulls and the Detroit Pistons in depth. And we were all talking before, and I know how excited he is about this conversation. So without further ado, I'll kick it over to you, Vince.
Hey, thanks all the guys for having me, especially Lloyd, who issued this invitation, David, to you as well. Very important topic. I feel like I need to introduce the keynote speaker for this evening, Bakari Sellers, a two-time New York Times best-selling author, of course, civil rights activist, voice of the culture, a voice that is very needed right now in these changing times. He's, of course, of good stock as the son of Gwendolyn Sellers and civil rights leader Cleveland Sellers. A lot of you may know him from the Bakari Sellers podcast on The Ringer, a CNN contributor. He has been working with President Barack Obama, Benjamin Crump, James Clyburn, crafting the way that the movements have been going over the past several years. Of course, he is a Morehouse graduate and the youngest legislator in South Carolina State at 22. Bakari's in South Carolina right now. He's not leaving there, so he's seen a lot of basketball. Bakari, how you doing this evening?
I'm more blessed than I deserve. Let me just say that I am from the big city of Denmark, South Carolina, where we have 3 whole stoplights and a blinking light. And my mom and dad always tell me the 2 most important words in the English language are the words "thank you," and they're not nearly said enough. And so, David, for your leadership and vision and partnering with the Black Coaches Association, Lloyd, for just even, I'm a big believer in being intentional and purposeful. And you having that intentionality and purposefulness and bringing this panel together and having this discussion is so important. One of my heroes and best friends in the entire world, I'm texting with her right now saying, you won't believe who we're honoring. I'm having this amazing time as a Black coach that I want to lift up. Her name is Dawn Staley. And so, it's amazing. I was scrolling through looking at all the names of the individuals who are in attendance today. And it's just an honor to be in your presence. And so in the words of the great American poet, Sean Carter, also known as Jay-Z, you could have been anywhere in the world, but you chose to be here with us tonight. And so thank you. Let me also pause. If you hear little 6-year-old voices in the background, those are my twins, Sadie and Stokely. They're buy one, get one free today, if anybody looking for twins. But those are my heartbeat, and my beautiful bride is in the back, ushering them up and down the steps as it's night time around this place. So thank you. I look forward to it, Vince.
No, man, look, it's funny you talked about Dawn Staley. So let's ask about your basketball bona fide, since you were cracking about my height earlier. Do you still actively hoop is the question. Can your knees take it?
So let me be 100% honest with you. I was so good in basketball in college that I went to law school. Let me start there. I'm about 6'5", 220. I still can shoot it. I was a double machine in the Ultimate Lifetime Fitness League. And I get out there and I try to practice with the girls every now and then when coach lets me, but that ain't often or at all. I still love the game, love the sport. And I love being around it. It's no greater team sport in all the world.
Well, I guess with that, I'm not even going to ask you if there's footage of a 6'5" sweet shooting jump shot. I'm not even going to go into that because I don't think we have footage of that. I'm just going to take your word for it. But I will ask you, what are your thoughts on the NBA season so far as we're coming out of the All-Star break and heading to the last 25, 30 games or so?
I always go through this, and you see it whether or not you were in church, or I don't think this will probably be the first time anybody compared the NBA to the church, or particularly the Black church, or whether or not you're in politics. You always come to this point in time where you're in this transition. It's a generational transition that's occurring. And when you have the likes of Steph Curry, and you have the likes of LeBron James, or Chris Paul, and you have these heroes and icons who are on the tail end of their career, kind of clashing with these new burgeoning superstars, the SGAs of the world. It's fascinating to see, and that's that growth and development that you're starting to see, and the way. And one of the other things that's fascinating is the way people consume not just the sport, but the news around it. We saw that in politics, how many people no longer watch the traditional news of CNN, Fox, and MSNBC, although our ratings have popped over the past, since the inauguration. But people consume news in different ways, what they call non-traditional media outlets. And it's fascinating to see how the NBA actually grows with those non-traditional media outlets, something that you probably experience on a daily basis, how you have people who get a microphone. By the way, I mean, I say this with just a little bit of jest. We need to ban microphones. Too many people have podcasts and too many people can just
Agreed.
whatever they want to say and put it up on YouTube. But it's fascinating to see that. And I've appreciated just this past Sunday, although my girls didn't necessarily perform. You had the Elle Duncans of the world, you had the Andrea Carters of the world, you had the Chanays of the world. I mean, you had that type of representation, and it's always feels good to see that representation in the gym and sitting behind those microphones.
So last one before we get into the Black history stuff. Everybody has a Mount Rushmore, so to speak, or at least a starting five. So you can give me your Mount Rushmore or your starting five all-time NBA players.
All-time NBA players.
Yeah.
LeBron James is one of the greats. I think that history will be extremely kind to him, particularly when you're taking, if you look at some of the teams he had and being able to go to the NBA Finals year in and year out with, great players, but Boobie Gibson and Sasha Pavlovich and Zydrunas Ilgauskas and Drew Gooden and others, I think people will look kindly upon his run. Michael Jordan, of course. I would probably put LeBron at the one and start Michael at the two. I know I'm tricking the deck a little bit,
You are.
but whatever, it's mine. Tim Duncan is one of the greatest players to ever play the game and does not get nearly the respect he deserves. I'd put him at the four. I love Shaq, but Kareem would give Shaq work. And so I'd take Kareem at the five. Um, and at the three, I mean, I don't know. I'm fascinated by just flat out scorers like Bernard King or Carmelo Anthony, just people who could flat out score. But if you're looking at greatness, I don't know. I might slide Moses Malone in there and just go big, and you wouldn't get a board all day. Um, that's an interesting one. But there've been so many greats. But I think that my top three of all time are LeBron, Mike, and Kareem Abdul-Jabbar.
Like you ain't going wrong there, no matter what order you put
And
it.
people forget how, I mean, winning matters, and people
Yes.
forget that one of the greatest, I mean, Bill Russell's probably the greatest winner, but Kareem didn't lose a lot. That was,
No.
I mean, the man switched names and still won. I mean, he won under every name he had. I mean, I just think that should mean something when we're talking about all-time greats.
Look, 6 MVPs. That hasn't been topped. That might not ever be topped. It's one of those things that history has not been as fair to Kareem as it should be.
Well, I mean, and to tie into our discussion we're having, and I think that a lot of people recognize this, is the sacrifices you make to speak out for what you believe to hold true. And, there was such an intersection during the time of Kareem and Bill Russell. We've seen the picture of, Bill Russell and Kareem and those individuals and the work that they did, uplifting various movements. And when you take those stances, sometimes your stories are not written as full as they want, but that's the sacrifice you make to improve the plight of a people.
Yeah, nobody tells you that in the beginning. You're doing what you're doing in the moment, and history goes the way that history goes. I think we've seen that with Colin Kaepernick. We saw before, like you said, with Kareem and all of those guys. I know we're going to have maybe one player and a couple of coaches who might come on at some point and have a couple of questions for you. But before then, Bakari, this year's Black History Month theme is Black History and Labor. I'm very curious, what does that mean to you when you hear that?
Many times when we're talking about working class folk, we forget about the struggle of Black folk in that working class movement. Coming up in Denmark, many people worked at the textile companies and textile factories growing up, making, minimum wage, but they stayed there for 40, 50 years. Their father worked there, their grandfather worked there. They went to the technical colleges in the community. They were the fabric of our community. And many times their contributions are overlooked. But that is the story of, I could talk to you all about George Elmore, for example. George Elmore in 1946 was deemed to be a Renaissance Negro. In 1946, he was a black dude, so fair-skinned that he could pass for being white. He owned a liquor store, a five and dime, drove a cab, and took pictures on the side. And Elmore versus Rice, when he filed a lawsuit when he was denied access to the ballot, is the reason African Americans can vote in the South. But that's not a story that we know. I think about Sarah Mae Fleming, who sat down on a bus 18 months before Rosa Parks. She was grabbed by the back of the neck, punched in the stomach, and rolled down the steps. But she joined with the enterprising lawyers of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund and laid that foundation in action and law. I think about Harry and Eliza Briggs, who filed Briggs v. Elliott, which was the first case filed in the landmark collection of cases known as Brown versus the Board of Education. And so when you're talking about labor, when you're talking about the struggles of our people, particularly, and we have to think about the moment that we're in, and coaches are fascinating, and particularly college coaches. I know we have some college coaches on here as well, because you're molding people, you're molding these young men and women at a different age, right? And many of these stories and many of the narratives around these heroes and heroines that we just don't know, but if we did, would show us a roadmap to be able to traverse these paths that we're trying to go through today. And these moments require some, Vince, level of individual responsibility, because it's our job to share those stories today because they're not being taught anywhere else. My uncle, Milton Parker, coached at Monmouth University. And he, to this day, he goes with me to the University of South Carolina basketball games. We really don't miss a home game. Sits right beside me. We sit right next to media row. And to this day, he reminds me all the time of Vivian Stringer putting up 130 points on him in the NCAA tournament, and he never forgives her for it. Never. Said, she ain't have to run that score up on me like that. But he tells the story of the gymnasiums, and many of you, I saw Coach Stackhouse on here. He'll probably know this story or know these stories more than most, but he tells the stories about how all the kids used to get together and play from North Carolina Central, Chapel Hill, Duke, NC State, and how back then them Central boys used to beat all of them, right? It didn't matter. They beat all of them. He would tell the story about Earl to Pearl and everybody else, and just having that knowledge and understanding of who it was to be Black during that time empowers you to stand on shoulders and look forward even today.
You mentioned where you grew up. I grew up in Detroit, where first Black middle class, auto industry, everything else was
Right.
filled and started there. Subsequently, that meant, a lot of people in my generation were first generation college students, because we were the first ones who had to go to college and had to get that level of education and inspiration, from ourselves pretty much. So just to fill in the blanks a little bit more for those, who didn't know, depending on where you grew up in the South, I'm clearly in the Midwest, but just in general, Bakari, what are some of the challenges that the Black leaders, the athletes, and the coaches deal with today? You mentioned college coaches having to mold young players. I would assume a lot of pro coaches have to deal with molding younger 18, 19-year-olds.
It's different now, man. And I'm only 40, so I ain't trying to sound like nobody old ass uncle, right? I am, because I'm not sure I would have made it if we had the kind of social media and the fishbowl that these young people are living. Listen, I love Coach Pierce, but can you imagine his Instagram back in the day down at Freaknik in Atlanta? All of these things. You look at some of these guys, you're like, you would have never made it if there was Instagram and Twitter. And we have to approach it like that when we're judging these young people. But even more importantly, the United States of America is the greatest country in the world, but it's unique because it's the only country where you're penalized because of the zip code that you're born into. And we have to understand the societal ills that come with that, particularly if you're Black in this country. And I'm not talking about people calling you nigger. I'm not. But what I am talking about are the fact that we live in communities where we have food deserts, right? Where kids go to school and their heating and air don't work and their infrastructure is falling apart. Now, let me back up a little bit and define a food desert. That's where you can't go a mile or two and get access to fresh fruits and vegetables, right? Where you live in these areas where you don't have clean drinking water. What if I told you, Vince, that there are 100 cities in the United States that have less potable water than Flint, Michigan? And the overwhelming majority of those cities are where Black and brown folk and Native American folk live. They live in brownfields, and so you're drinking unclean water. You're eating processed foods. You're inhaling unclean air, and so you have these issues that you deal with that other communities don't necessarily deal with. And on top of that, you're being undereducated and violently miseducated, and those are. And what I remind folk, particularly athletes or people who have the ability to make it out, is that you must, and this is the only thing that I ask you to pass along. You have to, you have to lift while you climb. You have to. That is the responsibility that we have. And as you make progress, as you put your community on your back, as you build your platform, because we're now not talking to individuals, we're talking to brands, we're talking to individuals who have branded themselves. They must understand that the responsibility they have to our culture is very similar to the greats who've come before. Because whether or not you are the star or whether or not you are the best practice player that ever put on a Pacers warm up, you have to make sure you lift while you climb, because there is so much value that you represent in the story you share.
It's funny you
Hey,
mentioned that.
Vince, can
What's up?
I interrupt real quick?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Because Bakari started off talking about our younger generation of athletes and what they have to go through. One of our guest players is on right now. He's got a question for you, Bakari.
Sure.
And I think it ties into how you just started that last segment. So do we have him on? It's Tyrese Halliburton, our point guard here in Indiana.
I'm in now, LP. I can see you now, LP. Bakari, how are you doing? Just wanted to pop in, ask a quick question. I think for us as a younger generation, and especially as active players and with social media at our fingertips, and we can let, our thoughts be known, rather quickly, especially with a president now who maybe a lot of us, NBA players don't necessarily agree with. I'm curious to kind of hear your opinion as with many things that go on in the country, many things that continue to go on. How do we make the decision? Like, what are the right things for us to speak up on? Like it's easy to kind of chime in on, things here and there. How do we differentiate and decide which ones are really worth, us, taking a step and speaking out on?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, because one of the things and the difficult push and pull is that you see people. I mean, there are commentators who make millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars, who are talk about your sport, talk about you every day, and they talk about everything, but they're like a mile wide and an inch deep, right? And so they don't necessarily have the depth, but they talk about everything. And so you get that pull of, do you want to go down that path, or do you want to go down another path? My advice to you, and I'm not really in the advice business, but if to answer your question directly, you should speak to things that make your heart flutter. You should speak to things that really move you, that you feel deep in your belly. For example, and the best way for me to describe it is, people ask me, Bakari, what are your biggest political issues? And Tyrese, first of all, I respect your game. You are a true point guard. It's an honor to be on here with you. For me, number one is African American female mortality. And people are like, why is that your biggest issue? I say, because if you want to highlight systemic racism, which is a word that people they say there's no such thing. And then I'm like, no, Black women are still 3 to 4 times more likely to die during childbirth than white women. In fact, my wife, when she was giving birth to our twins, she lost 7 units of blood, and I had to be her advocate. I don't know if you're married, I don't know if you have kids or not, but one of the things you realize really quickly as a man in your household, and your wife or girlfriend or partner is having a child, you become her number one advocate. And I remember that. I was screaming and yelling because she wasn't feeling well. She was breastfeeding both Sadie and Stokely, and she began to throw up and she passed out. And the doctors were like, "Oh, she'll be okay." And the nurses, and I was like, "No, no, no." So I called her, I FaceTimed her doctors. They were three Black women. I FaceTimed them. They rushed, they left their kids at home. They came, they pulled back the sheets, and my wife was just laying in blood. And she spent the first 36 hours of our kid's life in ICU. And we see that, and it crosses over socioeconomic levels. You can be on Medicaid, or you can be a Black woman that's Serena Williams, who suffered the same thing, or you can be my wife. And I speak out about that issue and tell you all about that issue because that issue is something that I've learned about. It's something that moves my spirit. It's something that makes my heart flutter. And so what I'm telling you is you don't have to go out and be Stephen A. and talk about everything, but you can actually talk about those things that directly affect your life, your loved one's life. My daughter, at 10 months old, went through a transplant, and so I encourage. She got a liver transplant, so I encourage other Black folk to be living donors, to be donors, and I just those are things that have a positive impact on our community. And the last but not least, and this is something that is, something that you have to remember is that when you speak out, one of the things you should demand is accountability, because you're going to realize that there are going to be issues you speak out on, and you're going to look around and be like, wait a minute, where is everybody else? But if there's an issue regarding X, Y, and Z, they expect us to be there, or they want you to use their platform. But when you have an issue, you're by yourself. And you need to make sure that you recognize that the movement and the work that you do is a two-way street, and demand people pay attention to you just as you pay attention to them.
Appreciate you
Great question.
coming on, Ty. Yeah, that's a hell of a question. And I think understanding how important it is to speak about things that matter to you is the first pathway, especially as we're dealing with our players and trying to be mentors and leaders. They need to see it in us, in the actions that we have towards things that matter, so that they feel the confidence and also the necessary steps in order to do that. We have one more guest for you, Bakari.
Can I just chime in real quick? I see
Yeah.
Coach Bickerstaff down there. It's an honor to be on, but I just wanted to piggyback real quick, Tyrese. Uh, you know this now because you are a leader on the Indiana Pacers. I mean, you are what they call a face of the franchise, but you do recognize that leadership is lonely, right?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of people don't understand it. I also, and I don't mean to step on any toes with the way anybody's taught you about leadership, but one of the things we don't necessarily do, particularly in the Black community, is teach leadership the way we should. We do it relatively perversely, and we think that people are leaders based upon how many followers they have, right? We think based upon how many people they can put in a church pew. But one of the things I've learned from the movement and others is that leadership begets other leaders. That's how you determine a true leader, by how many other leaders you cultivate around you. And so by you being willing to speak up and speak out, the value of your leadership becomes more apparent when you have others around you who are doing the same thing and following in those footsteps. It's not the people who are just with you who follow you, but it's those people who have the ability to carry those same traits and characteristics.
Thanks for that, Bakari. We got Coach Bickerstaff. He's got a question. JB.
Hey, what's up, fellas? Bakari, thanks for taking the time to do this. Everybody, thanks for setting it up and getting it organized. Lloyd, as always, Vince, David, Pooh, appreciate you guys. Tyrese, appreciate you hopping on. My question is part statement for the group and then part question for you, right? So growing up, some of my greatest mentors were the people that coached me. Right. So I still have conversations. I literally just got a text from my high school coach in Denver. And we were having a conversation today because one of my assistant coaches went home to Seattle for the break, and he went to watch his nephew play in the AAU tournament. Right. And he talked about just how nasty the tournament was and how the coaches were initiating a lot of it. Right. So coaches talking shit to kids, like amping their kids up to talk, amping parents up to talk. So I guess the question for you is like understanding how important coaches can be and how influential coaches can be. What are your thoughts or suggestions for how we, as college coaches, professional coaches, can influence coaches who work with our youth so that they're taught things properly? Because when you think about it, there's 450 players around there in the NBA, right? There's probably 45 new jobs in the NBA every year, right? People don't just give these jobs up as far as players and those types of things. So all these kids don't end up making it to the NBA, but they've been influenced one way or another. And you can't go to a business job and act the way that some of these guys are being trained is the proper thing to do in competition. My question is, again, and I apologize, it's kind of roundabout, but how can we help influence cultural change, right? And it's a cultural change to what AAU looks like, or youth basketball in general, from a coaching standpoint.
That's a great question. One of the things that I would kind of recall, and you probably would agree with this, is that when you were coming up around that time, coaches didn't necessarily have as many jobs as they have today. And what I mean by that is, although coaches were fixtures in the community, Coach Bickerstaff, you are now not just a coach, but you are people's father figure. You are people's brother. You are people's psychiatrist, people's mental health professional. You're giving them advice and counseling on domestic situations, financial advice. I mean, you have taken on these roles. And what I recall, and something that I echo to people all the time, is I'm a product of the African proverb, which I'm sure you are as well. And we have to get back to that it takes a village to raise a child. And I think that there are some people who do not necessarily understand that, gravitate towards that, or grasp it. And so when you have these individuals who are um, uh, not necessarily on the same wavelength, or these individuals, particularly some of these AAU coaches, because I go to high school basketball games all the time, and it's not just AAU. I mean, you see it at high school games. You see the clips on online all the time of the games that have to break out or the break up because the fights that happen. I mean, we just had one in Charlotte not that long ago. And so one of the things that I would say is, not only does it take a village to raise a child, but you have to be willing to bring other people. And coaches sometimes get a little selfish. Y'all don't want people in your orbit. You have things going the way you want them to go, but you have to be willing to bring in those positive influences around to help fulfill and fill out that village. One of the things that I love about Dawn Staley and her program is that you look up around these girls for the past decade, and you have other Black lawyers, Black doctors, you have other people who are just part of the nexus and the family that help mold this program and help mold this team. One of the things that you all can do when you're talking about these AAU coaches or these high school coaches is make sure that they have people around them, not just mentors, but just other strong-willed voices who want to help build that community. Dr. King talked about it all the time. Dr. King was brilliant because he only gave people two choices. And I tell people, leaders all the time, you guys have to stop giving people more than two choices. When you give a young person or just anybody, more than two choices, you confuse the hell out of them. Dr. King gave people two choices. And in answering the question of where do we go from here, he said we could either have chaos or we could have community. Chaos or community. And I think what you're talking about is the chaos that we see day in and day out. And what we have to do is build community. That means putting the infrastructure around these individuals, yourself and many others. That takes time because you're trying to win games. I know what you're trying to do. You're trying to build culture, win games. But you also have to be willing to go down to these AAU coaches, help them build that culture, help them build that community, and then bring them into yours. The last thing that I'll say is that um, basketball is very emblematic of society in that um, I saw Ant do this move the other day because Ant loves to spin in the traffic. Ant Edwards would go down and he'll spin in the traffic. But he started doing this thing where he spins in the traffic and then he steps back. So it's not a complete spin. It's like a spin and step back. And only he can gather and elevate and shoot the ball like that. Nobody else can do it like Ant. And I started to see young people emulate that move. And basketball is like that. People see the moves that Ant makes or SGA makes, and they emulate that. But one of the other things that we can do is be examples in everything else we do in our lives for these young folk, because they don't see, like, Tyrese Halliburton is a fascinating individual, but they may only see him dribble a basketball. Particularly with our Black athletes, we have to put them out there in other situations, showing what they can do that is not just dribbling a basketball, but how they contribute to society. It's the same thing with coaches. Coaches have to be out there in the community doing things outside of just coaching. So people are able to see that you are this figure in the community and they can emulate that. The best thing, and to summarize this, the best thing we can do in our respective communities is be an example. And I want us to be an example, not just in the work that we do day in and day out, but the things, Coach Bickerstaff, that make you a great man, the things that make you a great husband, a brother, the things that make you a great student, and allow people in your world to see that. And sometimes that's tough, but that goes a long way, especially with young, impressionable, up and coming coaches. I hope that made sense. That was a long answer to a long question.
Yeah, I was gonna say I gave you a long question, but I appreciate it.
No, I appreciate it. No, I watch some of these, I look at some of these coaches on the sideline, and the first thing I do is like, who raised y'all? Like, where'd you learn this from? And the thing is, they didn't learn it from anybody. They haven't learned from anybody the right way to do it or the right way to approach it. And it translates into the men that they are, and women that are learning the sport from them.
It's funny you brought up, and JB, of course, comes from a Black head coach as a father. I'm curious, Bakari, because Black coaches, Black athletes are far more visible now. You see them all the time, maybe more so players, because coaches, like you said, we don't have, JB ain't out here showing us Freaknik tapes or nothing like that. You know what I mean? Lloyd ain't showing us, how he kicking it in the Bay. But by and large, coaches are far more visible. Players are far more visible at a young age. They're confronting, breaking stereotypes, sometimes reinforcing them. How do you sort of further the progression, the evolution into how they are viewed? Like you said, bringing them into being three-dimensional figures, and not just.
That's a tough one, because we have to allow ourselves to be used in that fashion. But the best example is people want to see Don. They want to see Penny. They want to see Juwan Howard. They want to see these folks fail. They just do. And so whenever there's a misstep or whenever there's a loss, those things are magnified and highlighted in ways that they're not normally highlighted. And that is something that we know to be true. We just have to live with. I mean, you see the tenure of some of your compatriots in the NFL, right? And you tell young men this all the time, that they have to run faster and jump higher, but you do as well, even as coaches. And one of the things we can do is make sure that people are able to see more of us. And that every other group of coaches doesn't have to live like this, but it's a challenge for us. And they have to be able to see the full version of who you are. They have to see, Vince, your word was so apropos, which is the full three-dimensional shape of who you are. They have to see the things you do, because right now with the way media, and I'm not a Friedman fan, but Friedman did write the book, The World is Flat, and it's due to our interconnectivity. I mean, people have access to so much and a wealth of information that contributing that much more will help them get a more full picture of you. Because if you don't do it, then a lot of times these websites and blogs that come from places with malintent will fill in those voids for you and create an image that's unhealthy.
It's funny. It's one of the things that you said earlier, maybe a couple questions ago before Tyrese asked his, struck out to me. And one of my favorite quotes that I apply to the NBA when I'm talking about the league is James Baldwin saying, "America is the greatest country in the world. Therefore, I reserve the right to criticize her perpetually."
Yeah.
I think, and leaning into the question, what better way can the NBA as a conglomerate, whether it's, DEI initiatives, where I feel like we should stop saying DEI, because I feel like that is the new N word. We should say diversity, equity, and inclusion, and force people to say exactly what they mean. But what can the NBA do as far as honoring Black heroes, telling Black stories, not just during this month, All-Star Weekend, throughout the year? Is it the NBA's responsibility? Can they accomplish those goals?
I mean, is it the NBA's responsibility? I don't know. I appreciate the commissioner and all of those who work in Manhattan for making that and being intentional and purposeful. But I do know it's the responsibility of those coaches. It's the responsibility of the players and people like, man, Bakari, why are we getting more responsibility? Well, uh, we don't really have that choice or that luxury. February 8th of 1968, my father, who was a member of SNCC, was protesting the All-Star Bowling Alley, which is in Orangeburg, South Carolina. And they ended up going back to the campus of South Carolina State after the police came. And South Carolina State troopers lined up in front of the campus and they fired shots into the group of students, and 3 were killed: Henry Smith, Samuel Hammond, and Delano Middleton. My father, along with 28 others, were wounded. My father went to the hospital. He was pointed out by a black sheriff's deputy and he was arrested. They charged my father with 5 felony counts because they knew him to be a member of SNCC, deemed him to be an outside agitator. He was looking at a maximum of 75 years in prison. And after he was shot and arrested, to add a little injury, a little salt to the injury or wound, figuratively, not literally, but they housed him on death row. My father was later granted a bond of $50,000 and reduced to $20,000. His parents were able to get him out. And then he went to trial some 4 years later. All the officers who fired into the group of students were found not guilty for killing unarmed black men. But my father went to prison. They backdated his indictment from February 8th to February 6th. All of his charges were dismissed except for one. And he was charged, tried, and convicted of rioting. And he became the first and only one-man riot in the history of this country. I share that story because on that night in justice, it left young black men without, gone, paying what Abraham Lincoln called just one of the greatest sacrifices one could make. It left mothers without their sons. It left the pages of our country's history stained red with blood. But that's my story. And my father today, he ended up serving a year of hard labor. He's 80 years old. He still walks a couple miles every day, got a couple girlfriends, just living an amazing life. A former college president. But people want us to act like that history is so long ago. My dad still has colored on his birth certificate, right? Colored on his birth certificate. My mama was a part of the desegregating class of Hamilton High School in Memphis, Tennessee, still alive today. So these are the stories of our parents and grandparents, and we have to remember that history is still alive. And when you go out and you wear a Timberwolves or a Hawks or a Hornets or Lakers or whatever it may be, or a Pacers jersey, of course you're playing for the front, but a lot of times we forget we're playing for the name on the back too. And that name carries so much and has been through so much that we have to honor it. And regardless of what the NBA does, because you know what's going to happen? NBA is going to have a new commissioner one day. And you're going to have owners that the owners ain't going to vote like you. You know what I mean? So look, every owner ain't going to be like Mark Cuban, where you know where he stands, or you know what his voting pattern is, you know what he's doing. He's out campaigning. That just is not going to happen. But you have to be willing to represent that name on the back of the jersey for everything that it means and everything that it's been through.
That is a lot. Like one of my close friends, Bomani Jones, his mother sat in the Oklahoma City sit-ins in the 50s, and she's still alive. So it's not like these people are relics. These people are three-dimensional figures. It's not that far removed, even though it was in the 1950s. These people are still alive with the scars and the stories, like you said with your father. Didn't forget that your daddy got 2 girlfriends thing. I would love to get into that. But
that's a couple. I think you said 2. I think I said a couple.
You said a couple. Could be more. But we got another person coming on, Malik Rose, another good brother. Malik, how you doing, man?
You're on mute, Malik.
I know. Sorry. Hey, it's good to see everybody. What's going on, Vinny?
What's up, Malik?
David, good to see you guys. Coach Bickerstaff, Lloyd, thanks for the invite. And Bakari, thank you for joining, man. Always, I don't know you, but always enjoy your commentary, be it on, CNN or podcast or whatever. And really appreciative of the way, not only what the work you do, but the, I guess the persona you put on a national stage. I think it goes a long way. My question is, and it's weird because I may be in the minority. I'm pretty sure I'm in the minority, but I don't necessarily, and this isn't anything against athletes. I just think they have a full-time job. But I'm not one that wants an athlete to be my leader, my Black leader. So with you, coming from your political background, who are, so I mean, you got your Cory Bookers, your Hakeem Jeffries and all that, the normal handful that you hear, but who are some of the young leaders you see on the horizon, the next group that's going to take the mantle and go from here?
So there are a few things. I don't. I hear you when you say you don't necessarily want an athlete to be your spokesperson or leader, and um, I give everyone the space and don't have. I don't want to put that level of expectation on you, right? So, I do believe that that we have a responsibility, but at the end of the day, if you just want to drive 4 Teslas and live, in your gated community, that's fine, right? I don't think that we should put that onus on everybody. And I think a lot of times we say, because you did this and because you made this amount of money, you must do this. I don't come from that. I say that if you're willing and you want to, and that is something that moves your spirit, then we can use more forceful voices on that battlefield. Um, and in terms of just young people who are doing the work, I mean, I look at people like Frank Scott in Little Rock. I look at people like Randall Woofin in Birmingham, Alabama, or Andre Dickens in Atlanta, Georgia. I look at these young people who are literally toiling in the vineyard, who are Aaron Ford in Nevada. But there always are going to be a new crop of leaders who grow up and use their voices and talents and in just different ways. I mean, and you don't have to be in politics, as you know. I mean, a lot of the new voices that we'll hear will be in music or entertainment. A lot of those voices that we'll hear. I mean, one of the people who I appreciate when they speak up is someone like John Legend, who utilizes his platform in different ways. I like when people attempt to speak their truth to power from whatever background they come from. I don't think that people have to shut up and do X, Y, and Z. I remember that was a big thing. That was a big thing, like 10 years ago, when they were like, everybody should shut up and dribble, because at the end of the day, you look on the other side and you're like, wait a minute now. Such and such ain't shutting up and doing nothing. What's Bosa, Nick Bosa out there running around,
Yeah.
and wearing
Oh, go ahead. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
no, I'm just saying, and wearing his colors proudly, and more power to him. I just think that being Black in this space, if you decide that you want to lift your voice, you must know and understand the struggle of those who've come before.
I agree with everything you said there. I think I know my question more so came, and you answered it. But it's more so, my question was more so born of like athletes. Yeah, I mean, since the beginning of time, sports has played a big part in at least starting the conversations, if nothing else. And athletes definitely need to be part of the fight. I mean, everybody on the call probably, it resonates with them that whole, you got to lift while you climb. I think everybody on the call had to deal with that, and we should be part of the struggle. We should be part of the voice and speaking out. I just don't like it. It bothers me that, our demographic, we don't have, like we do have, but it's like we can't organize behind real political leaders. Like, we are experts in basketball. We are experts in
Well,
basketball.
let me tell you, that's a trick. And I appreciate you saying that, because it ties into something I said earlier, which is when JB was asking the question about being an example, right? Because I agree with you wholeheartedly. And what I've deduced is a very, very simplistic outlook on culture. But I always tell people, you cannot expect a child to be a Black doctor if they've never seen one. You cannot expect a child to be a Black lawyer if they've never seen one. And the reason that I want people to be able to see Malik Rose or Tyrese Halliburton outside of just their jersey and dribbling a basketball and have that three-dimensional, and even Coach Bickerstaff look at them, is because you're more than that. right? And you allow individuals to be able to dream to be more than just that basketball player, more than just that person who dribbles that ball. And so we have to do a better job of uplifting those people in our communities and going back to our communities. And so you don't just have to worry about people who, you've heard it. We all hear it. I ain't gonna make it out unless I'm a rapper or a hoop. All right. We hear that a lot, but many times it's because culturally we don't see those examples of those other things that we too can achieve. And we have to do a better job of making sure that we're being that example in our respective communities.
Fair enough. No, I appreciate it. Thank you, and really enjoying the conversation. Thanks.
No, I appreciate you. Great question, man. I enjoy watching you all the time.
Thanks, Malik. Appreciate you, man. Last one from me, Bakari, and this might be a little full. As a journalist, whenever a Black issue comes up in sports, they're always asking me, Vinny, what do you think? Can you write about this from the quote unquote Black perspective? Same thing happens when something comes up and they say, Vinny, can you talk to coach such and such and get his Black perspective? Can you go to Doc Rivers? Can you go to person here? One thing that I always say in response is, y'all need to talk about this amongst yourselves. You can't just put this on the Black writers, the Black coaches, the Black ball players. What responsibility can we shift to our white counterparts in this space? As much as it is our responsibility and our burden, it's not for us to do by ourselves, I can assume.
Yeah, I mean, I hear you, but there's also a certain element of protecting the integrity of your story and being able to give it the relevant cultural kind of competency. I mean, everybody can't, if we're trying to do a profile on understanding, for example, Ann Edwards, right? Everybody can't do that profile, right? There is a certain level of cultural competency that's required. Dare I say, there's a certain level of diversity necessary, right? To go in and understand what that means to come from, the heartbeat of Atlanta, Georgia, and go to Georgia and be the greatest athlete to go through the University of Georgia since Herschel Walker, and what that means, right? And carrying that mantle, what it means to know growing up down south that it's a bad storm if Waffle House closes. Like, everybody know that. Like, that's how you need to leave town if Waffle House closed, right? But being able to have that level of cultural responsibility and competency is necessary. I also believe that, look, racism is not Black folks' problem to cure. Please, everybody, take that burden off your shoulders. When you leave, just leave that burden somewhere. We have a lot of things to cure and remedy this country of, but that's not ours. And although sometimes we may be the right, or might have the right messages, sometimes we are not the right messenger. And we have to make sure that people, our colleagues, are prepared to go into their own spaces and have those conversations amongst themselves. I firmly believe that there is more power in this group, Coach Pierce, than we probably know or probably give ourselves credit for. And I look forward to individuals in this group or people they touch getting to places like ownership, getting to places in power where we can continue to tell our story, and we can continue to uplift our communities. And so I'll end where I began, which is to simply say thank you for this amazing opportunity.
My brother, thank you again. Appreciate you. As always, you have dropped a load of knowledge. I still don't know about your jump shot. We just gonna have to take your word for it.
It's wet. It just is what it is.
Coach Pierce.
Yeah, to both of you guys, I think this has been a fascinating conversation. Obviously, this is what we aspired when we talked about having this conversation for Black History Month, celebrating Black history, but also being challenged in a lot of ways. Bakari, you are the modern day example of Black excellence, Black representation. You are an intellectual, you are a visionary. I think a lot of us who have not seen you speak are now inspired. I've followed you for many years. I think having you on here has been special. So we thank you, we salute you. We will have you back for many other events, and I can't thank you enough. So we definitely appreciate you.
Thank you.
Big thank you to Vince, to Bakari, Pooh, and the Black Coaches Association. We're looking forward to doing many more events like this. And for anybody who is interested in either getting in touch with myself, Pooh. We'll send a follow-up email, and anybody who's looking to feature Bakari a little more in the future, if we want to bring up the slide, here's some information on how to get in touch with his business team. And again, appreciate everybody. Thank you. And Vince, I don't know if you want to just close.
Hey, I just want to say a lot of coaches, Coach Stack, JB, Malik, all of you guys that I've seen throughout the years. Appreciate you guys allowing me to be here today. Lloyd, of course, I appreciate the invite, even though I was probably second behind Mark Spears. Appreciate you either way. And hopefully I'll see you guys soon, as we all are trying to lend our voices to have positive impact in whatever our field of discipline is.
Thank you all, and good night.
Thank you. Thank you. That was great.